Welcome back to ViViMaT. Our next speaker may be the youngest one of the lot. Carina Morstein was recommended to me by 3 colleagues independently, so there must be something really good about her. She studied chemistry and molecular sciences at the University of Bern, Switzerland, where her master thesis was awarded with the Faculty Award in Chemistry and Biochemistry. Since March 2019, she is a PhD student in the Applied Nanotribology group of Martin Dienwiebel at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, where she investigates graphite lubrication mechanisms under high mechanical load for application in rolling bearings. Carina, the stage is yours right after this. Coatings is a peer-reviewed journal of coatings and surface engineering published online by MDPI on a monthly basis.
And now, graphite lubrication.
Hello everyone, my name is Carina Morstein. I'm a PhD student at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, KIT, in Germany. And I would like to thank Carsten Gachot and Stefan Eder for this opportunity to present my work in this format. So today I'm going to talk about the graphite lubrication mechanisms under high mechanical load. And the reason why we want to investigate graphite is because as a solid lubricant, it can be used in applications where conventional liquid lubricants reach their limits, so namely at high temperatures, under high mechanical loads, or for example in vacuum. And in this project, together with our project partners, the IPEC in Karlsruhe and the Fraunhofer IWM, we want to investigate the lubrication of rolling bearings under high mechanical load. Therefore, graphite is a suitable material. And although graphite has been around for quite some time now, its underlying wear and lubrication mechanisms are still under debate or not known even. But what we do know is that especially thin carbon layers tend to rupture easily under high shear forces. So in the work I'm going to present you, I conducted a parameter study and investigated the influence of different parameters on friction and wear, namely the graphite coating thickness, the applied normal force, and the underlying substrate roughness. And to do so, I first developed a rather simple application method. So I started with a liquid graphite suspension, and then I coated polished iron plates with this graphite suspension with the help of an airbrush pistol. And these graphite-coated iron plates were then tested in a microtribometer against the steel sphere. So the steel sphere was pressed down onto the graphite-coated iron plates with a given normal force and slid over the surface for 500 linear reversible cycles. The tested graphite coating thicknesses ranged from 0.2 to 17 micrometer, and I investigated 3 different normal forces, 69, 165 and 402 millinewton, which yielded a Hertzian pressure between 0.5 and 1 gigapascal. And to get a better insight into the underlying mechanisms, I also investigated the samples after the microtribometer experiments with different microscopy methods. So what we saw in the microtribometer experiments when having a look at the steady state coefficient of friction versus the graphite coating thickness was that the general trend was always the same for all the 3 different normal forces. So we always had the lowest steady state coefficient of friction with the thinnest coating we had at 0.2 micrometer. And an increase in the layer thickness led to an increase in friction, probably due to plowing effects. When having a look at the influence of the normal force, we saw that the trend was the same for all the tested graphite coating thicknesses, but here you can see the plot for the coating thickness at 3.5 micrometer. And as you can see, an increase in the normal force actually leads to a decrease in friction. And depending on how much you've worked with solid lubricants so far, this might come as a surprise to you. But it's actually exactly what we expected for graphite and is known for other solid lubricants as well, and has been postulated by Bowden and Tabor. And they said that the coefficient of friction mainly depends on the interfacial shear strength, the real contact area, and the load. And for solid lubricants, in contrast to conventional liquid lubricants, the real contact area as well as the interfacial shear strength do not really change that much. So it just mainly depends on the applied load. And we also had a look at just the coefficient of friction during the whole experimental duration, so the whole 500 cycles. And in black, you can see the reference experiment we conducted, where we just slit the steel sphere against an uncoated iron plate, so to have the bare metal contact as a reference. And as you can see, depending on the coating thickness, the behavior was quite differently. So for some of them, the coefficient of friction was quite stable after a short run-in time. And whereas for others, we had a steady state and then a distinct increase in friction up to the value of the unlubricated contact. And I can already tell you that much. This distinct increase in friction was due to the fact that we had material transport, and the graphite material just got all transported out of the wear track and therefore couldn't lubricate anymore. And this distinct increase in friction was now in the next slides defined as the lifetime of the coating. So we had a look at the lifetime of the coating and how it's influenced by the graphite coating thickness and the applied normal force. And what we saw was again that the general trend was always the same. So an increase in the graphite layer thickness led to an increase in the lifetime of the coating as it was able to separate the two friction partners for a longer period of time. Now, when having a look at the normal force, we saw that an increase in the normal force led to a negative impact, so a decrease in the lifetime. And this was no surprise to us because, as mentioned earlier, thin carbon layers have been reported to easily rupture under these high normal and thus shear forces. But I wanted to investigate the wear mechanisms, of course, a little bit more in detail, and the material transport. So I had a look at this coating thickness here, so 3.5 micrometer. And I had a look at both the plate and the counterbody after the experiments with the confocal microscope. And what you can see is that for all the experiments, so conducted at the three different normal forces, the underlying iron substrate got uncovered because the graphite material got transported to the sides of the wear track. And especially at the higher applied normal forces, so 165 millinewton and 402 millinewton, we see either some first hints of abrasion or even severe wear due to abrasion, which was then also visible on the counterbody. So if wear took place on the counterbody, this was visible as a flattening of the sphere profile, and by the diameter of this wear scar, we could then calculate the wear volume and thus the wear coefficient. What you can see here in this plot is now that an increase in the normal force led to an increase in the wear coefficient as well, which is in coherence with the results we saw regarding the lifetime. So at the higher normal forces, the lifetime of the layer was limited due to material transport, and therefore the wear coefficient also on the counterbody was higher. Now, this effect could be counteracted by increasing the graphite layer thickness. So at the thickest layer, we had 17 micrometer, not displayed here. We didn't observe any wear on the counterbody at all. And I wanted to have a deeper understanding on what's happening during the experiment and the underlying wear mechanisms. So I chose a parameter set, in this case 3.5 micrometer thick coating at the lowest normal force of 69 millinewton, and just stopped the microturbometer experiments after 10, 20, and 300 cycles and had a look at the samples under the confocal microscope. And what we saw was that already during the first 10 cycles, we have material transport onto the counterbody, which means that in reality we have a graphite-graphite contact on and for the main part of the experiment and not a steel-graphite contact. And these brighter areas here are due to topographic flattening, so the roughness peaks of the graphite coating got flattened. After 20 cycles, a third observation was added. So you can see here, hopefully, these tiny brighter patches. And they are due to the fact that here the graphite delaminated in the form of patches. And after 300 cycles, this effect was, of course, even more distinct. And after 500 cycles, as mentioned earlier, the whole underlying iron substrate was uncovered. And if we would have conducted this experiment for a longer period of time, we would have begun to see wear due to abrasion, as for the experiments at the higher normal forces. So everything I've shown you so far just demonstrates that our tribological performance is limited by the adhesion of the graphite layer to the underlying iron substrate, and thus the lifetime of the layer. So we asked ourselves on how we could improve the adhesion of the graphite to the substrate. And to do so, I increased the roughness of the underlying iron substrate by a factor of 7, which also made it much more comparable to the industrial applications or the surface roughnesses in industrial applications like the rolling bearing we're going for. And I then had a look at the samples at a normal force of 402 millinewton, and I investigated the two thinnest graphite coatings I had so far, 0.2 and 3.5 micrometer thickness. And what you can see is that in terms of friction, the graphite coating applied onto the rougher iron substrate in red actually behaved quite similarly as the one from the previous experiments applied onto the smoother mirror-like substrate. But when we have a look at the lifetime, we see that we were actually really able to increase the lifetime by a factor of 7.6 times. And this is also, or this can be also seen in terms of the wear coefficient of the counterbody. So with the graphite coating on the rougher substrate, we were able to reduce the wear coefficient drastically. So you might think that, okay, we were indeed able to increase the adhesion of the graphite coating onto the iron substrate. But then we had a look at the wear coefficient on the plate, and we saw that this was actually not the case, and the wear on the plate was sometimes even increased with the rougher substrate. So this seems to be some sort of contrast, and we were wondering why are we able to increase the lifetime of the coating and decrease the wear of the counterbody, but it seems like the adhesion was not increased or not improved. So how can that be? And to answer this question, we had a look at the samples after the experiment with confocal microscopy and transmission electron microscopy. And as you can see, there was indeed more material transport than previously. So the graphite got again pushed to the sides of the wear track, and there was distinct material transport onto the counterbody. But nevertheless, there always remained a thin carbon layer right in the interface, which seemed to be thick enough to cover the surface asperities of the iron substrate. And as the graphite gets trapped in the grooves from the polishing process, it also seems to supply graphite material for a longer period of time. And we had a look at the sample or at this thin carbon layer with transmission electron microscopy. And what we could see was that it had a thickness of around 50 to 130 nanometer and actually exhibited a rather turbostratic structure, which was something we would not have expected from the theory. And we are currently investigating this fact a little bit more in detail and are working on a paper. So with this, I'm going to summarize my talk. So I investigated different parameters and their influence on the tribological performance. And what we can see was that an increase in the coating thickness was actually beneficial in terms of the lifetime and the wear of the counterbody. But as a trade-off, the friction increased due to plowing effects. When increasing the applied normal force, all the effects we observed were actually directly the opposite. So the friction decreased, but as a trade-off, we had a shorter lifetime and more wear on the counterbody. And when having a look at the underlying wear mechanisms a little bit more in detail, we saw that we have material transfer onto the counterbody already in the first initial cycles, and a topographic running in of the coating. And then shortly afterwards, the system suffers from severe delamination. So we wanted to increase the adhesion of the graphite coating to the substrate. As mentioned in the previous slides, we were not able to do that, but due to the increase of the substrate roughness, a thin carbon layer could be formed, and this thin carbon layer was able to improve the tribological performance drastically. So what we are currently now working on is to test this whole system now also under rolling motion to make it much more comparable to the application we're going for, so the rolling bearing. And now at the end of my talk, I also want to thank some people. So I want to thank Professor Reinhard Schneider at the KIT for the preparation and conduction of the transmission electron microscopy analysis. I would of course like to thank my supervisor, Professor Martin Wiebel, who also had a talk in this ViViMaT format in the first session. And I would like to thank the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft for the funding of this project, which was made together with my project partners from the Institute of Product Development, Karlsruhe, the IPEC at the KIT, and the Fraunhofer Institute for Material Mechanics in Freiburg. And I would like to thank them for the nice and successful collaboration so far. So with this, I'm very at the end of my talk, and I would like to thank you for your attention.